A mysterious night shift worker, a powerful CEO in disguise, and a secret no one was meant to uncover. But when the truth finally surfaced, it shook an entire corporation to its core. What was this man hiding in the shadows? The Lin Sun Logistics Distribution Center on the outskirts of Denver was a place where daylight rarely mattered. Within its cavernous walls, the artificial glow of the lamps kept a permanent, dull light over endless rows of steel shelves, loaded with boxes and pallets. Forklifts hummed like giant insects, and the air carried the scent of oil, dust, and tired bodies. By day, the place was chaos. By night, it should have been still. But lately, whispers had crept through the staff lounges and break rooms. "Somebody's messin' with the equipment after hours," one forklift operator muttered to a colleague over stale coffee. "Saw a busted conveyor belt fixed clean overnight. Nobody reported it, though. And the spill behind Dock 6 last Friday? Cleaned spotless by morning." Another chimed in. "It wasn't on the cleaning crew's log." Stories stacked on stories. Lights seen flickering in empty corridors. A shadowy figure moving between aisles after the night shift clocked out. The name attached to most of them? Brian Roberts. A man so unremarkable, most of the day crew didn't even realize he worked there. He was seen as someone who kept a low profile. Thin and young, he couldn't have been more than 30 years old. Wearing a faded company uniform and his identification badge turned backwards, and sometimes a safety vest. Didn't chat. Ate alone. Yet everywhere he passed, things quietly improved. A safety railing bolted tighter. A frayed cable replaced. Broken light switches mysteriously working again. When the reports finally reached Charles Linson's desk, he barely looked up from his financial projections. Charles was the kind of executive who measured human worth by productivity metrics and incident reports. Safety mattered only when it threatened margins. But something about these rumors gnawed at him. Why would a man fix things off the clock? Charles asked his operations manager one evening, his voice as cool as the leather chair he sat in. "No idea, sir. Maybe covering his own mistakes. Or someone else's." Charles leaned back, fingers steepled. "I don't like unknown variables. Find out what he's after." A week later, no one had anything concrete. Cameras in half the areas were outdated, and Brian had an uncanny knack for slipping past the rest unnoticed. So Charles made an uncharacteristic decision. One that shocked his own reflection in the mirror. He'd go down there himself. He pulled strings, arranged an alias, and by Thursday evening, Charles Linson ceased to exist, replaced by Manny Willis, a newly hired night supervisor, complete with steel-toed boots, a borrowed badge, and a clipboard. The warehouse at night had a different pulse. The hum of machines was softer, but the vastness of the place felt heavier, as if the darkness itself pressed down on the metal racks. Manny kept a low profile, doing what no CEO in his position would ordinarily consider, watching, listening, blending in. By midnight, he spotted Brian. The man moved like a ghost, gliding between workstations with quiet purpose. No wasted motion, no hesitation. He checked an unreported leak under a hydraulic press, then gathered tools from an abandoned maintenance station without logging it. Charles Manny followed at a distance, careful not to betray himself. Brian didn't notice. At 1:30 a.m., Brian entered the northwest storage wing, an area rarely used after hours. Instead of clocking out like the others, he unlocked a side maintenance closet with a key that no one was supposed to have. Curious, Charles edged closer. Inside, through a narrow gap in the door, he saw what looked like a makeshift command center. Clipboards lined the walls, each labeled with dates and locations. Handwritten notes about malfunctioning equipment, exposed wiring, even names of supervisors who ignored complaints. There were photographs too. Frayed cables, corroded supports, sharp metal edges where guards should have been. Charles's stomach tightened. This wasn't petty sabotage or a man covering mistakes. This was methodical, obsessive. Someone tracking the company's sins. Brian sat at a dented metal desk, scribbling into a logbook, expression calm but grave. A battered photo frame stood by his elbow. Charles couldn't see the image. For a moment, the CEO in disguise felt something he didn't often entertain. Unease. Who was this man? Why was he doing this in silence? And how much did he already know? Charles quietly backed away, pulse quickening, retreating into the maze of storage racks. He wasn't ready to confront Brian yet. He needed to understand more, and Charles Linson realized he might not be in control of everything that happened under his own roof. Not anymore. The night stretched on, heavy with unasked questions and the steady hum of machines, as the ghost in the warehouse carried on his invisible vigil. For the next 3 nights, Charles Linson, still in the skin of Manny Willis, observed Brian Roberts from a calculated distance. The warehouse had its own quiet rhythm after midnight, and Brian moved within it like he'd been built for this strange, hidden world. Charles kept a notebook in his back pocket, jotting down what little he could gather without being obvious. 9:12 p.m. Replaces loose bolts on conveyor 7. Not logged. 11:05 p.m. Cleans spill behind dock 3. No report. 12:44 a.m. Welds loose railing by cold storage. No witnesses. There was something unnerving about the man's precision. Brian never rushed, never hesitated, and never acknowledged anyone unless directly spoken to. And even then, his replies were sparse, polite, and hollow. "He's weird, man." One of the other night shifters, a burly guy named Ortiz, grumbled during a break. "Moves around like some kind of machine. Doesn't even hang out for a smoke. You ask him something, he just nods and walks off." Charles pretended to chuckle, masking his interest. By the 3rd night, he couldn't take it anymore. His curiosity had outgrown his caution. At 1:20 a.m., with most of the crew distracted by a forklift issue near receiving, Charles saw Brian slip away through a side hallway that led toward the northwest wing, the same route from before. This time, Charles followed at a tighter distance. Brian walked with steady purpose, a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder. No radio, no clipboard, just a pocket flashlight that cut a narrow path through the dimly lit corridor. Charles crept behind shelving units, ducking into side niches. His heart thudded harder than he'd like to admit. The last time he'd broken a rule himself, it had probably been decades ago. This wasn't the kind of risk a man like him took. But something about Brian made him uneasy, a feeling he couldn't shake. Brian reached the old maintenance room and unlocked it with the same unauthorized key. The door clicked shut behind him. Charles waited, counted to 15, then approached. The room was supposed to be a storage closet for broken parts and rusted tools. What Charles saw when he cracked the door open made his stomach clench. The place had been transformed. A single desk lamp cast a circle of pale light over a makeshift operations hub. Metal shelves lined with binders, folders, and loose sheets of paper. Walls plastered with printouts and photographs. Handwritten notes ran in neat, careful lines. Dock 6 railing unsecured since March 12th. Ignored. Conveyor 12 emergency stop defective. Reported no action. Accident. R. Kearns, April 22nd, broken wrist. No incident report filed. There were photographs of injuries. A man's arm bruised deep purple. A rusted chain link snapped clean. A hydraulic press leaking oil inches from where someone's boot had stood. And then there was a faded newspaper clipping, yellowed and creased. The headline read, "Worker crushed in loading bay malfunction. Faulty equipment blamed." Next to it, a handwritten note, "My father. No one paid." Charles swallowed hard. The duffel bag Brian carried was now open on the desk, filled with tools, gloves, and a digital camera. His back was to the door as he meticulously logged another entry in a battered notebook. There was nothing unhinged about the man's expression. No fury, no mania. Just a cold, relentless focus. Charles watched, every instinct inside him warring. Part of him wanted to burst in and demand answers, to assert authority, to stop this quiet rebellion. The other part, the quieter, less comfortable part, knew better. This wasn't rebellion. It was reparation. And Brian wasn't a threat to the company. He was its conscience. Charles eased the door closed, leaning against the cold metal for a moment, staring into the dim corridor. For years, he'd built a business that moved fast, ignored small problems, and rewarded only what could be measured. He'd known, in some distant way, that things fell through the cracks, that accidents happened. But those were numbers on reports. Lawsuits his legal team buried. Compensation checks signed without reading the details. Now here was a man cleaning up the wreckage he left behind. Alone. Silently. Driven by the face in that newspaper. By blood and memory. Charles straightened, the reality of it sinking like cold iron in his chest. He had come down here expecting a thief, a saboteur, maybe a lunatic. He'd found something worse. A man who cared. And cared enough to do it without recognition. That was a kind of threat Charles didn't know how to fight. He turned and walked away, the night stretching ahead of him, every familiar corner of his empire now feeling strange and unsteady. Brian Roberts kept working, unaware that someone had finally seen him. The next evening, Charles didn't put on the Manny Willis badge. He left it on the desk of the night office, next to a half-empty cup of stale coffee. He buttoned his jacket, stepped into the darkened warehouse, and sought out the one man he wasn't sure he had the right to face. The air was thick with the scent of machine oil and cold concrete. Forklifts hummed in the distance. Metal clattered somewhere near shipping. But here, in this quiet corner near the old loading bays, the world was still. Charles found Brian kneeling by a conveyor motor, carefully adjusting a loose belt. The man's face was half-lit by the flickering overhead bulb, his hands steady, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, Charles simply watched, not as a CEO or a man hunting for secrets, but as a witness to something he'd spent his entire career pretending didn't exist. Brian felt the stare, and without turning, spoke. "Didn't expect to see you again." His voice was low, calm, neither surprised nor angry. Charles cleared his throat, the words catching somewhere between pride and shame. "I owe you a conversation." Brian finished his adjustment, tightened a bolt, wiped his hands on a rag. Only then did he look up. His eyes weren't accusing. They weren't bitter. They carried something far heavier. A patient, bone-deep exhaustion Charles recognized in himself on sleepless nights. "Sit down," Brian said, nodding toward an overturned crate. Charles did. They sat in silence, the warehouse breathing around them. "I saw the room," Charles admitted. His voice felt foreign, brittle. Brian didn't flinch. "Figured you would. People like you always do. Eventually." The words weren't said with venom. It was worse. It was resignation. Charles laced his fingers together. "Your father. He worked here." Brian gave a slow, hollow smile. "Foreman of Dock 6. 22 years. Loyal. The kind of man who brought his lunch in the same dented thermos every day and believed loyalty earned protection." He paused, staring down at his calloused hands. "And then a chain broke. Machine he'd reported as faulty for months. Nobody fixed it. Nobody stopped the line. The chain snapped, cargo fell. Broke his back in 3 places." Charles felt a tightness in his chest, one he'd carried for years without naming. It wasn't just the story, it was that he could already guess how it ended. "No compensation," Brian continued quietly. "They buried the report, called it operator error. Let him go while he was still in a hospital bed. My mother, she begged them. But men like you don't listen when there's nothing to gain." Charles closed his eyes, the memory clawing its way forward. A vague recollection of a line item on a quarterly risk assessment. Incident Dock 6. Resolved. An executive meeting. Some chatter about liability. The legal department reassuring them it was handled. A settlement offer rejected. Family labeled uncooperative. Case dismissed. And then it vanished. He remembered, and God help him, he hadn't cared. "I'm sorry," Charles said. Brian let out a long, humorless breath. "Don't need your apology." Charles looked at him, thinking seriously about this situation and what he would do next. He also thought about how Brian must have learned the business skills from his father, how to fix the machines, how to know different areas. He thought about what he owed them. "You stayed," Charles said quietly. "After everything." Brian shrugged. "Somebody had to. These people, they don't see the cracks until they fall through them. I couldn't stop what happened to him. But I can damn well make sure it doesn't happen to the next guy. The two men sat in that truth, heavy and raw. You kept records, Charles said. Why? Why not go to the papers? The authorities? Brian met his gaze. Because the story wouldn't be about the people here. It'd be about scandal, headlines, stocks dropping. The workers would get chewed up in the fallout, lose their jobs. Management would reshuffle and nothing would change. I don't want revenge, Mr. Lin's son. He hesitated, his voice low and steady. I want them safe. There was no theatrics in it. No grand speech. Just a man who'd carried too much too long. Charles felt something give way inside him, a brittle piece of armor snapping. I built this place, he said. Made it efficient, profitable. Told myself that was enough. That as long as the numbers looked good, the rest would sort itself out. He swallowed, ashamed at how small the confession sounded. Brian didn't offer comfort. That wasn't his way. But his voice softened a fraction. I used to think my father was stupid for trusting this place, Brian murmured. Now I think, maybe he just hoped too hard. Another silence passed between them, but it was different now. Less a gulf, more a bridge barely forming. Charles exhaled slowly. I want to fix this. Brian raised a brow. Fix what? Me? The company? The past? The culture? Charles said. The things we let slide. The men we ignored. The mistakes we buried. Brian leaned back against the wall, studying him like a mechanic might study a cracked gear. You can't undo it, Brian said. I know, but you can stop pretending. Charles nodded, and it felt heavier than signing a contract or closing a deal ever had. The old loading bay clock struck 2. Somewhere a radio crackled. The night crew moved on. Charles stood. He offered a hand. For a long moment, Brian stared at it. Then, with a quiet sigh, he took it. Not as forgiveness, but maybe as permission. And Charles Lin's son didn't feel like the most powerful man in the room. 2 days later, the warehouse buzzed with a strange kind of anticipation. Word traveled fast in places like this, in half-whispers and sideways glances, rumors stacking on top of each other like crates in a forgotten corner. Something had changed, and everyone felt it, though no one could name it. That evening, the night shift gathered near Dock 3 under the pretense of a routine equipment check. In truth, it wasn't routine at all. Brian stood off to the side, leaning against a steel post, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He hadn't asked for this meeting. In fact, he tried to avoid it. But Charles Lin's son wasn't a man easily dissuaded anymore. The CEO stood beside the old maintenance clock, dressed not in the fine-tailored suit of a boardroom tyrant, but in simple work slacks and a button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He held a stack of papers in one hand and a weathered folder in the other. When the shift bell rang, Charles stepped forward. The murmur died. I won't waste your time, Charles began, his voice carrying not with authority, but with something rarer, honesty. Most of you know me as the name on your paychecks, the guy on the quarterly reports. Truth is, I've spent more nights in corner offices than factory floors. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. A few men shifted. Some women folded their arms, skeptical. But no one left. I was wrong, Charles said plainly. And I'm here to make that right. He lifted the folder. It was thick, stuffed with printed reports, handwritten notes, faded photos. Brian recognized it instantly. His ledger, the one he never meant for anyone to see. This, Charles continued, is a record of every corner we cut, every broken machine we ignored, every person put at risk because it was easier to look away. Compiled by one man, working long after his shift, fixing what others neglected, without praise, without pay, without complaint. He turned, finding Brian in the crowd. This man. Heads swiveled. A few startled gasps. Some of the younger guys who'd never spoken more than a passing hello to Brian now stared at him like seeing a ghost made flesh. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't move. I asked him to take a promotion, Charles went on. A seat in an office. A title, a raise, a corner desk. He smiled faintly, almost self-deprecating. He turned me down. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the group. Not mocking, but surprised, maybe even impressed. He said if I wanted to change this place, it wasn't going to happen in boardrooms. It would happen here, on these floors, in these hands. Charles gestured around at them. So from tonight forward, Brian Roberts is your new night shift supervisor. And effective immediately, this company is implementing a worker-led safety oversight board. Every department, every shift, every floor, no more silent corners, no more ignored reports, and no more names getting buried. A murmur of approval, cautious but real. Charles nodded once, then turned to Brian. You built this place back from the shadows. It's time you did it out in the open. He extended a hand. Brian hesitated, then stepped forward and shook it. A few of the old-timers clapped. Someone let out a short, sharp whistle. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't confetti and banners. It was real. As the meeting dispersed, people clapped him on the shoulder, nodded in passing. Not as some untouchable legend, but as one of their own. A man who'd watched over them long before they knew they needed watching. Charles lingered a moment, then quietly left, his figure retreating into the night. The burden of old sins lightened but not forgotten. Near dawn, as the last truck rumbled out and the radios crackled their final shift reports, Brian moved through the warehouse alone. The night had thinned to silence. Dust hung in the shafts of early morning light cutting through high windows. At the far end of Dock 6, an old railing rattled loose as a worker passed. Brian knelt beside it, pulled a wrench from his belt, and tightened the bolt with practiced ease. A kid, no older than 20, slowed as he passed. "Hey, Mr. Roberts," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. Brian looked up, gave a faint nod. The kid smiled and walked on. Another followed, a young woman carrying a clipboard, pausing long enough to offer a quiet, "Thanks for everything." By the time the sun broke the horizon, the last of the night crew had gone, but their small acknowledgments lingered in the air like echoes. Brian wiped his hands, set the wrench back in his belt, and looked around the warehouse, his warehouse. And though no one else saw it, he smiled again. Not for recognition, but because at last someone was watching the cracks, and someone would be there to fix them. Not for glory, not for reward, but because it mattered, and always would. This story reminds us that true heroes rarely seek the spotlight. They work quietly, protecting others without expecting praise. What would you have done in Brian's place? Would you stay silent or risk everything for change? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here at Embrace the Journey for more stories that move the heart and challenge the mind.